Well, thank you so much, Carter. You're very kind. And hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us here this evening. It's incredible how quickly May has just flown by here. And yes, hopefully we will have the opportunity to be able to meet in person soon. So I'm just going to share my screen, so just stand by, and then we shall begin. So here we are. This is, in fact, the only morning warbler that I've actually seen this year. It's been a bit of a strange migration in southeastern Ontario, but that's what June is for, I suppose, and June is fast upon us. Uh, I must admit, I've never actually been to Sault Ste. Marie. I was born and bred in Brighton, Ontario, and I've recently moved back there with my family, and I have always been very curious about Sault Ste. Marie, particularly so with this issue of OFO News. I served a two-year term as the co-editor of OFO News alongside Paul Nicholson, and Ken McAlrick wrote this incredibly informative but also very inspiring article about birding where the north begins and all about birding in Sault Ste. Marie, and that really piqued my interest. And since that time, that was actually, I've labeled that incorrectly. That was June of 2017. Ever since that time, I've really been interested in getting up to Sault Ste. Marie, and I hope that time can come soon. But for now, we will go with the virtual approach. Just before we jump into the presentation, I would just like to acknowledge that where I am located is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga people. This is area covered by the Williams Treaty. So we're going to start by doing a bit of an envisioning exercise. So I would like you to imagine that you are in a pine forest. And I know not all pine forests are created equal, and that's part of the beauty of nature and diversity of habitats. But generally speaking, imagine that you're in a forest with lots of pine trees, particularly red pine as we see here, as well as white pine. And you're walking along, and I think for me, one of the most significant factors in a pine forest is the scent. I mean, the scent of pine trees is so nice that we artificially put it inside of our cars. So imagine that you are taking in the scent of the pine forest and you're wandering along, and maybe you're walking on some uneven terrain, so you're looking at the ground a lot. Lots of roots that you want to make sure you don't trip over, but among some of those roots, you see some late spring pine forest flowers, like this blue bead lily, Clintonia. It's something that you can see in bloom right now in many pine forests in this part of the world. Another one, a personal favorite, twin flower, a small shrub that grows quite close to the ground in the herb layer. Again, very common in pine forests. So you're continuing to walk along, and you're taking in the scent of the pine forest, and you see some fringed polygala or gaywings, another common species blooming right now in the pine forest. One that's typically a showstopper. Maybe somebody is stopping to take a photograph of it. Pink lady slipper. Another personal favorite, Pipsissewa or Prince's Pine. And then on the topic of scents, not just the scent of pine, but also the scent of wintergreen. And you might even reach down and pick one of the wintergreen berries and get a sense of what a pine forest tastes like. In the case of wintergreen, it tastes like Colgate toothpaste, FYI. And it is edible, you're not going to get sick. So if you find yourself in a pine forest, find some wintergreen. Pick the berries, smell the scent, you'll see where that wintergreen scent comes from. What is this that we hear? So two species that you can find in a pine forest. The first one, a pine warbler, very aptly named. There are a lot of warbler names that are not particularly descriptive of the bird, but the pine warbler is an exception to that, thankfully. They are very much tied to pine trees, including in migration when things are often a bit of a mishmash in terms of where you find birds. So the pine warbler, and then the second song was the chipping sparrow, a really nice comparison between the pine warbler and the chipping sparrow. And especially at this time of the year where the breeding season is very, very much underway, pine warbler is one of the earliest arrivals on the breeding scene. You are hearing lots of pine warblers and probably a good number of chipping sparrows in pine forests. While you are trying to not trip on roots and you're looking down at wildflowers and shrubs like these, maybe you're tasting a wintergreen berry and you're smelling wintergreen as well as the scent of pines.
Sorry, Ian. People are not able to hear the bird songs.
Ah, well, that could be a bit of a problem with a birdsong presentation. Here, I will just do the classic unplug and plug back in. So I will stop share and start share again. Thank you for letting me know.
If you just click that button that says share computer sound when you're sharing your screen, that makes a difference. Yeah.
I suppose it wouldn't be a proper Zoom call without a Zoom faux pas, which 2020 and 2021 have been oh so known for. All right, take two. So again, at first we had the pine warbler, and then second, the chipping sparrow. So altogether, what I would like to bestow upon you this evening is this concept that learning bird songs can be very much a holistic experience, where you're using all of your senses. You're not just using your ears, you're using your eyes, you're using your nose. Sometimes you might even be using your sense of taste, depending on if you're into things like foraging. This is a presentation I've done various variations of over the past couple of years, and I'm very pleased to be joining you as part of the Sault Ste. Marie Birding Festival this evening. And as I mentioned before, hopefully we will get a chance to do this in person very soon. Just a quick logistical note, the majority of the photos in this presentation are in fact not by me. They're by a good friend and colleague, Andrea Kingsley, also lives here in Brighton. Just to be a bit more specific, I should note all the good photos are by Andrea Kingsley. I have a completely mediocre camera, and I have quite a common habit of taking bad photos of really neat birds. So I thought I would share just a couple quick examples of that before we jump back into the bird song. So bad photos of neat birds number one. This is a Hudsonian godwit. You would never be able to tell based on the photo, but take my word for it, yes it is. And then one of my all-time favorite bad photos of neat birds number two is this Kentucky warbler. And this actually could have been at least a 5 out of 10 photo, but you can see the out of focus branch going right through and in front of the bird's head. So there you have it. That's a typical photo from me, so that's why I asked Andrea to provide many of the photos. So thank you to Andrea in advance for doing that. A lot of the content of this presentation is contained in an article that Mike Cadman and myself co-wrote for last year's June issue of OFO News in praise of birdsong, and this was written to prepare for the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas, which of course is well underway right now, and hopefully people are out in the field enjoying that and looking for fledged young and birds carrying food and all the rest. One of the big focus areas in that article, as well as in this presentation this evening, is the concept of learning through filters. Another way that sometimes people characterize this is chunking, and this is a fairly common teaching or pedagogical tool, chunking things into related groups. By no means is this revolutionary. It's not an Ian idea, but it is a strategy that has worked for a very, very long time for many people. One of the chunks that we are going to look at is the habitat chunk, and I really first came to this through the Algonquin Park series of nature books. And I used to work at Algonquin Park. I spent 4 summers there and spent time filling in to organize their educational program. And they have this wonderful series of books that the Friends of Algonquin, their partner organization, puts out. And it's really the everything of Algonquin Park, the birds of Algonquin, the mammals of Algonquin, the wildflowers, and so on and so forth. And this is a recent reprint. But the way that the majority of these books are organized is by habitat. You know, what birds do you find in a coniferous forest? What birds do you find in a deciduous forest, a shoreline, a lake, etc.? And that was really a game changer for me, this concept of not thinking based on the field guide, not thinking taxonomically, but thinking about where you are, context, which really makes sense because when you are birding, you are in a habitat. You might be on the edge of 2 habitats. In fact, that's generally where the best birding is, but the context is really important, and that all fits into this idea of a holistic approach to birding. I don't work for Algonquin now, so I'm not getting any sort of commission or anything by mentioning these books, but they're great. I highly recommend them, and again, they are organized by habitat. So habitat, well, what is a habitat? I mean, it's food, water, shelter, and space. Those are the basics. There isn't really a right or wrong answer to what the definitions of specific habitats are, because the word habitat by definition is from the perspective of a species. So if you're talking about an ovenbird, for example, you know, what is its habitat? It has very, very specific requirements. Every species has very specific requirements, you know, types of plants, insects that are there, amount of space, amount of sunlight, moisture, proximity to other features. But just to kind of simplify this, I thought I would break it down into 6 fairly workable habitat chunks. So deciduous forest, marsh, shoreline, field or field edge or meadow edge, lake, and coniferous forest. And again, this is not exhaustive, and each habitat is specific to each species, but this is a good starting point. And we're going to spend most of our time focusing on the various wetlands and the types of forests. So let's start in a marsh. Most people can get fairly ready access to a marsh. And a good starting point when learning bird songs is, what are the birds that you typically see in a particular habitat? And in a marsh, because visibility tends to be a lot easier because you don't have a canopy of trees, the visibility is great. So what do we typically see in a marsh? Well, common yellowthroat. Most of them are on territory now. What else do we see in a marsh? American bitterns. Maybe not always see them as well as we would like. Sometimes they're just flying by, or we might get lucky and see them despite the fact that they're camouflaging. As the name would suggest, marsh wren. Yes, also found often in a marsh. Swamp sparrow, maybe not as well named as it could be. They're more often in marshes than swamps, but occasionally in swamps as well. So when you go to a marsh and these are the birds you see, try to learn the songs of those birds next. And we will come back to these songs a little bit later in the presentation. If the wetland that you're in has more standing trees, standing shrubs, often dead trees and shrubs like this one here, it's maybe trending more into the swamp direction, in which case you might have species like this tree swallow. I actually took this photo this morning, and you can see it's not an award-winning photo, not an Andrea photo, but this was a nice little opportunity to take a picture this morning. Eastern kingbird, another one that you're often seeing on standing dead trees in swamps, and green herons. So depending on the type of wetland you're in, you have a different cast of characters, and if beavers are involved, that habitat might change in fairly short order. So habitats are dynamic, which always keeps it enjoyable. Some of the terminology that we're going to dig into, in addition to our examination of different habitats, There are many terms that we could look at. I'm only going to focus on a small number here because we don't have a huge amount of time. So we're going to talk about pitch. Pitch, not to be confused with what baseball pitchers do. Pitch is just very simply how high or low a sound is. So as we get older, as we grow up through childhood, our voices move from high-pitched to low-pitched. I actually had a very high-pitched voice, such that whenever I picked up the phone for a period of time, people would say, "Hello, Catherine," my mother's name. And then in a very short period of time, it switched to, "Oh, hello, Don," my father's name. So yes, my voice dropped quite a lot in a very short period of time. So we'll talk a bit about pitch. We will also talk about tone, the tone of voice. What kind of emotion are you suggesting with your voice? We can tell if somebody is happy or sad or sarcastic based on the tone of voice. Now, birds, most of them do not have the emotional complexity to have those types of emotions, but we can apply what we know of human emotions to the sounds that we hear of birds. You see the Baltimore Oriole on the right. To the human ear, they sound quite happy. Now, again, anthropomorphizing. Are they happy? I don't know. Some birds are more emotionally complex than others, but probably Baltimore Orioles are not happy in the way that we think about it, but it's a sound that sounds happy in human terms. So tone can be very helpful. Now we get into some music terms, and if there are any musicians out there, you will know these. Staccato. So staccato is something like each note is separated. It's not connected to anything else, and we will look at some examples of this. The opposite of that is legato, where the notes are connected. And again, we will look at some examples of legato. On the topic of legato, we get to warble, which is not what most of our warblers do. Some of them, but not most of them. It's more the old world warblers in Eurasia and Africa that warble. Similar to warble, a trill. One of the best examples of a bird that trills is the pine warbler. We've already heard that this evening, and we will hear that again. So that's some basic terminology. We will go through all of this with some examples, but I won't overburden you with any additional terminology. Another useful thing to look at when examining bird songs is different parts. And for this, we're actually going to go down to Nashville, Tennessee. We're going to go to Nashville and Tennessee warblers, which have nothing to do with Nashville and Tennessee. They go past Nashville, the capital city of Tennessee. Actually, I think it's the capital city. It's a city in Tennessee. I don't actually know if it's the capital. Should have checked that. Yes, they have nothing really to do with Nashville and Tennessee. They really should be called Spruce Warbler 1 and Spruce Warbler 2. That might be a bit more appropriate, although Nashville Warbler is a bit more of a habitat generalist. But this is a really nice comparison because the Nashville Warbler has a pretty distinctly two-parted song, and there are different ways that you can define the part of a song. Really, you can tell that a song has moved to a different part when something about it pretty significantly changes. Maybe it's the pitch, maybe it's the tone, maybe it's the speed, maybe it's the volume. It could be really anything that significantly changes. And the Nashville Warbler is a great example of a bird that just has the perfect two-parted song. And I'm just going to show you an example. I did have a sound recording, but it wasn't very good, so I'm going to play the one from the Sibley app and just put it up to the microphone. So as I say, that's a really good example of a two-parted song. The first part, a little bit slower. The second part, much faster. It's almost like a motorcycle engine that goes into a second gear. So that's a two-parted song. Nashville Warbler, typically found in mixed coniferous forests, but they are quite a habitat generalist. That's why they were extremely common on the last Breeding Bird Atlas. Less of a habitat generalist, the Tennessee Warbler. They're a boreal forest spruce tree nester, and they have a pretty distinctly three-parted song. Also, that's that sort of idea of a motorcycle revving up and going into different gears. So let's give this one a listen. So 3 different gears, a little slow, then fast, then a little bit faster, or revving its engines up. Great example of a 3-parted song with the Tennessee Warbler. Let's now move to another type of song pattern, rising, falling, or flat. Now, what do we mean by that? More specifically, we could look at speed, pitch, and volume. Does a song get faster? It could be rising in speed. Does it get slower? Then it would be falling in speed. Or does the speed stay the same from start to finish? In which case, it would be flat. What about pitch? Does it get higher? In that case, it would be rising. If it gets lower progressively, it would be falling. Or again, if it stays the same, it would be flat. And then volume. If it gets louder from start to finish, it's rising, quieter, falling, and flat. So the Viri is a classic example of a song pattern that is falling in pitch. Let's give it a listen. Where can you find Viris? Typically in hardwood forests with lots of beeches and maples. So think about other things that you see in a beech or maple forest. What plants do you see on the forest floor? That's your context. And this is what you might hear, as I heard this morning when I was doing field work.
Ian, I cannot hear that. This is Lynn speaking.
Anyone else able to hear that? Or not able to hear that?
No, I didn't hear it either. I heard the last one, the Nashville Warbler and Tennessee Warbler, but
Okay. Well, this is why having a backup is good. So I do have my Sibley app here, so I will just go to the Viri on the Sibley app. Could everyone hear the Pine Warbler at the start?
Well, I couldn't hear the Pine Warbler.
Really? Because I did select play computer sound, but I guess it chose not to. All right, that's okay. Let me just get the Viri on here. Could everyone hear that one okay?
I could hear that.
All right, good stuff. So falling in pitch, if you were playing notes on a piano, you would be going to your left. A species that is rising in pitch, the northern Perula. Usually Perulas, in terms of context, in the breeding season, they're in the tops of trees. I was very lucky to see this very tired one in migration, quite low to the ground, which is why I was able to actually sketch it. Never thought I would be able to sketch a Perula, as they are tree toppers, typically in the tops of spruce trees. Very difficult to see, especially being such a small warbler. So rather than falling in pitch, the notes getting lower, the notes with a Perula song get higher. So let's give the Perula a listen. Again, I'll just pull this up on the Sibley app. So rising in pitch, almost like it's rising in intensity as well. And then a species that rises in volume, we've just talked about this one, the Ovenbird. Now I've got a video, the sound is probably not going to work, but I will play the song here on the Sibley app. So the Ovenbird song doesn't always rise in volume. The first couple ones that we listened to pretty well stayed flat in terms of volume, but oftentimes it does increase in volume, and you can see that represented on the spectrograms as well, as we saw in the last presentation. So speaking of spectrograms, they can be very useful, especially when you are trying to determine if a bird song is more on the staccato side or on the legato side. There's a free app that you can get. It's called Spectral View. It's SPECTRAL and then View. And you can just download this, and it records songs and provides you with the spectrogram imaging, which is really, really useful, especially when comparing staccato and legato. So we'll get back to our Tennessee Warbler here. Super staccato sound. It's almost like parts of a sewing machine. And you can see it again in coniferous forests. And there you can see it represented on the spectrogram. Just play it again in the Sibley app as a comparison point. Especially at the beginning in the slower part, you can really see the separation between the different notes represented by these warmly colored lines at the beginning and as well in the middle part. Where the different notes get really close together, you can see that represented here on the right-hand side of the first song burst, and it's a little more difficult to see each individual staccato note, but for the most part, each note is quite separate. Compare that to something like a Warbling Virio, which interestingly enough also visually looks quite similar to a Tennessee Warbler. Nests in totally different habitat. Often find them more in shoreline type zones, particularly nesting in trees like eastern cottonwoods or perhaps in willows. And they're the opposite of the staccato, the very sharp separated notes. The notes are more connected. So I'll just pull the Warbling Virio up on the Sibley app, and you can see on the spectrogram there, you can see that there aren't those sharp separated lines as there was with the Tennessee Warbler with its very staccato sound. So here is Warbling Virio. So everything kind of sewn together and connected lazily in the case of the Warbling Virio. And that's perfect because many legato sounds, in fact, are warbles. And I mentioned earlier, a lot of our warblers don't warble, but we stole the name from an old world, several families of old world warblers. So yes, the Warbling Virio is not a warbler, but it is a Virio that warbles. What's in the name? Other warblers that aren't actually wood warblers, Rosebreasted Grosbeak. Rosebreasted Grosbeak has a really nice warbling song. They're also very easy to sketch because they just sit there up in trees. Let's give a listen to our Red-Eyed Virio song, and you get another nice example of a warble where the songs or the sounds are all connected together. Certainly not the sharp, separated notes of the Tennessee Warbler. And again, keeping our holistic, context-based view in mind. What is the context for a Rosebreasted Grosbeak? Probably a hardwood forest, and to be a bit more specific, because again, species have very unique habitat requirements, probably a semi-open area in a hardwood forest. They tend to be in areas with lots of sun. So you might have to put sunscreen on. with rose-breasted grosbeaks and thinking about all your senses. Maybe you are smelling the scent of sunscreen while hearing a rose-breasted grosbeak and feeling the sun on your eyes and putting on your sunglasses. Bring all your senses into it for the full experience. Similar to warbles are trills. Now, what's different between a warble and a trill? A warble has many different notes. Goes up and down and around and all over the place. Like in a Warbling Virio song, like in a Rosebreasted Grosbeak song. A trill stays on the same note. It's kind of like an opera singer that just goes, oh, and they just stay on the note. Pine warbler is kind of like the opera singer of the warblers, even though they don't warble, they trill. It should be the pine triller if they wanted to properly name it. So let's go back to the pine warbler song, since you were not able to hear it earlier. We will hear it now for the first time. So it just stays on the same note that it kind of repeats in a modulating fashion. And earlier we talked about rising, falling, flat. This one definitely flat. Sometimes, depending on the song type that a pine warbler is delivering, it might rise in pitch, it might fall in pitch, it might rise in volume, but typically fairly flat. And again, in those pine forests with wintergreen and the scent of pines, and wintergreen berries and yellow or pink lady slippers, probably yellow lady slippers too, more in sandy type soil. Lastly, we're going to move to sound quality. Quality is an area where we get a bit more into the anthropomorphizing because we can sort of apply human emotions. So again, some birds have more emotional and intelligence complexity than others. But that doesn't mean that we can't apply human emotions in the learning process. If it helps you to think of a Baltimore Orioles song as happy, great, go with it. You're not saying that the Baltimore Oriole is happy, you're not being unscientific, you're just using something that works for you for your own learning, for your own experience, and that's totally fine. Baltimore Oriole sounds quite happy. Rosebreasted Grosbeak also sounds fairly cheery. Scarlet Tanager, not so much. If a Scarlet Tanager were applied to human emotions, they might sound grumpy, or as it was very famously described by Roger Tory Peterson, like a robin with a sore throat. Let's give a listen to our Scarlet Tanager, our robin with a sore throat. This is another one in hardwood forests dominated by beech and maple trees. You're probably seeing things like sarsaparilla growing on the ground. And in early spring, when the first few tanagers arrive, you might be seeing things like white and red trillium, large-flowered bellwort, some of the beautiful spring ephemeral wildflowers. Again, think of the context, think of the big picture. It enriches the experience. And here we go with tanager. So you can hear those sort of burry or harsh sounds within the song of the Scarlet Tanager that gives it this sense that it's maybe somewhat grumpy or that it has a sore throat. Of course, no, it doesn't actually have a sore throat. It's probably not grumpy, although this one that I sketched was very tired. It had just arrived. If it helps you remember it, great, go with it. And just briefly again, we talked about quality with the Rosebreasted Grosbeak. In comparison to the Scarlet Tanager, they have a cheery quality. And to bring in Roger Tory Peterson and a quotation from him again, they were famously described by him as sounding like a robin that had music lessons. So much more melodic and refined sounding in quality than the Scarlet Tanager, which was a bit rougher. So it is now time to apply, and we're going to go back into a wetland, specifically a marsh, where you were seeing some of the marsh species that we looked at before. This is not an exhaustive list, but we'll just go through each of these 4. And rather than sort of focusing on what song is for each bird, let's focus on some of the things that we've talked about. What is the quality? How many parts do we have? So we'll start with the common yellowthroat on the left-hand side there. This is a great one because, as the name would suggest, they're very common. You can find them in most marshes. So in terms of rising and falling, it does both. It goes up and down and up and down and up and down, and they're quite famous for that. In terms of quality, maybe more on the cheery side, and you can get very creative with this. You can say it sounds sardonic, but it's easier just to go with kind of happy, sad, start simple like that. So yes, they have a bit of a cheery sound to the human ear. Rising and falling, staccato or legato, definitely more on the legato side. The notes all connected together, not sharp and separated like with the Tennessee warbler. And it fits more into the category of a warble. So a warbler, not called a warbler, that actually warbles. Ah, these names. We need to do something about the names, don't we? Moving along to the swamp sparrow. Speaking of poor bird names, swamp sparrow, more often found in marshes. Let's give a listen to the swamp sparrow song. So rising, falling, or flat, very flat. Flat as a board, flat as a pancake, the swamp sparrow, as flat as the top of the cattails in the marsh. Quality, instead of applying human emotions, you might compare it to something non-human, like mechanical sound. Has a sewing machine sound to it, certainly to my ear. And if you think, what, Ian, you're crazy, it doesn't sound like a sewing machine, that's okay. There's no right or wrong answer to this. It's totally subjective. It's whatever works for you. To my ear, sounds kind of mechanical, like a sewing machine, very flat, no rising and falling like with the common yellowthroat. More on the staccato side. You can hear the separate notes. Moving along to just below the swamp sparrow, we have the marsh wren. This is a fun one. The marsh wren, Carter mentioned that he just had his first marsh wrens, I believe, today or a day or two ago. So yes, they are finding their way into their territories to build all their proper nests and dummy nests, as marsh wrens are wont to do, to thwart their predators. This is one of the most memorable songs of the marsh. Here we go. So this is a good one for comparing parts. Generally speaking, there's a lot of variation, but generally speaking, you've got 2 parts, kind of like a Nashville warbler. The slower, higher part at the beginning, and then the faster, lower pitched part second. In terms of quality, again, more on the mechanical side, like a swamp sparrow, less so on the sort of cheery human emotion side. It's kind of like a trill. Some people describe it as a rattle. In fact, some people compare it to those rattles that sometimes people have during New Year's parties. Yes, remember when we got to do those in person? Soon, 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 it's coming. And then I thought we would finish off with one of the most unique and memorable songs of the marsh, particularly cattail marshes, the American bittern. It's almost weird calling it a song. It's more like an experience, hearing an American bittern. So here we go. So quality. This is a tough one. Does it sound happy? Does it sound sad? Does it sound mechanical? None of those really fit. And again, you just use whatever works for you. To me, it kind of sounds like an air pump. It sounds like someone's using an air pump. It's not mechanical per se, but it's a synthetic type sound. It goes up and down a bit, but everything is in that very low range. It's not a trill. It's not a warbler, not a warble. It's totally, totally unique. And you might not apply any of what we've talked about in this presentation. You might just apply whatever works best for you while keeping in mind the broader context. You might have heard the marsh wrens singing in the background of that sound clip. And I would say if you go to your nearest marsh right now, there's a good chance, especially if it's a cattail marsh, there's a good chance you can hear at least 2, maybe 3, maybe 4, all 4 of these species, as well as many others. You're seeing plants like broad-leaved and narrow-leaved cattail, other marsh plants like duckweed or European frogbit coming up. If you've got shrubby areas in your marsh, you might have things like red osier or dogwood. Frogs are probably calling. Don't forget about other animals outside of birds. Of course, there's not a lot of shade in a marsh, so I hope you have a hat and some sunscreen, maybe some water. All of these things help. It all helps paint the big picture. Keep the context in mind. Keep some of the terminologies and tips. Do what works best for you. And the advice that my father gave me that I still carry with me whenever I go out birding, look for birds with your ears. It makes for a very enriching experience, very enjoyable, and I wish you all the very best of luck with your ear birding. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ian. That was really good. Really good presentation.
Thanks, Carter. Sorry about the sound goof-ups. I should know better since I use Zoom on a weekly basis, but
That's okay. It worked out with the phone, so
there it is.
that was good.
Having a plan B is always a good thing.
Yeah.
The Sibley app is great. Yeah, be happy to take any questions.
Yeah. The first question is, what is the difference between a swamp and a marsh?
Yeah, so we have this great habit as humans of putting everything in these little boxes, and nature doesn't always fit into boxes, but typically a swamp has more standing trees and shrubs, many of which die, which creates habitat for things like the tree swallows like we saw earlier. Marshes tend to be more with herbaceous species like cattails and wild rice and so on. So yeah, it's a really good question, and you get into other types of wetlands, and there's lots of gray area, as there is in nature. It's all plenty of gray.
Yeah, you get, fens and bogs.
Yeah.
All that. Yeah, it becomes...
Yeah, what's the pH?
Yeah. Just going through here. Lots of, thank yous, and that was awesome. In the chat here. Oh, I missed
Thank you.
the app. You mentioned an app?
Oh yeah, it's Spectral View, SPECTRAL View, VIEW. I always make sure when I'm spelling something out that I don't say it at warp speed as most people do on the phone. Pet peeve. BVTCD. Goodbye. Thanks. You're like, whoa, wait. Yeah, Spectral View is it's great. It was a free app, and it records and paints your spectrograms as you're listening, which is really great, really useful.
Right. Any other questions for Ian? Oh, someone's getting better at seeing with their ears.
Good stuff. There's a neat book called The Singing Life of Birds. The author's name escapes me, but the Singing Life of Birds. And he says that he has a really great ability to visualize the songs. He admits right in the introduction that his ears aren't great, but he can see the pattern of the songs. He can basically see the spectrograms in his mind, which really helps. And with eBird now, just make a recording of a bird on your phone, upload the recording to eBird, it automatically creates the spectrogram, which is really cool. Now, fun fact, mockingbirds, when I lived in Toronto, and there are lots of mockingbirds, record a mockingbird mimicking another bird, which of course they do plenty of, often in rapid succession, and upload the spectrogram, and then compare it to the real spectrogram of the real bird. It's crazy. It's exactly the same.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, it's a
Funny-
fun
funny
little.
Funny story. The only time I've been really in the South was I went to Cuba for a week, and the
Aha.
first morning we were there, I'm like, oh, there's a northern cardinal singing, and I open up my field guide that I bought for Cuba birds, and no northern cardinal. Northern cardinals aren't in Cuba. I'm like, it was a mockingbird, which is abundant in Cuba. I'm like, it must have been a migratory bird that went up to Florida. And I thought that was really interesting that I for sure thought I heard a cardinal singing, but it was a mockingbird.
Yeah, so basically everything I've talked about in this presentation is totally void if there are mockingbirds around.
Oh, I've been
the takeaway.
Even starlings too. I've been in places where I've heard
big time.
an eastern meadowlark singing where I shouldn't be hearing an eastern meadowlark. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
the meadowlark here. I'm like, oh no, it's the starlings over there.
Yeah, starlings are underrated for their mimicking abilities. I've
Yeah.
heard them do bluebirds and all kinds of crazy things.
The ones around my house really like doing killdeers.
Yeah, that's a popular one for sure.
Yeah. Oh, I find BirdNet does a good job too with the spectrogram. Are there any other apps to help with bird identification through sound?
Yeah, I mean that's a great one. I always go back to the Sibley app just because you've got the bird songs right there as a comparison. In terms of automatically identifying them, somebody just showed me a program and I didn't get the name of it. I can find out and send it to Carter, and if you want to send it out in a follow-up or anything, I think it was designed just for the Atlas to basically
Okay.
identify everything that's out there. So I will get the
I
name of
know,
that for sure.
like the Merlin app is introducing audio version of their ID as well, in addition
Yeah,
to
I
phone.
heard.
I think it's only in beta testing right now, but
Yeah.
that means it should be out in the near future. And apparently it works even better than BirdNet, based on what I've been told. So,
Okay.
but yeah.
This is promising.
All right, one last call for questions here. And seeing as there is none, okay, thanks again, Ian. That was
Thank you.
fantastic. We definitely appreciate you coming out and doing this for us.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure, and I would love to be able to get to Sault Ste. Marie in person someday and get to meet some of you folks, and very thankful for programs like Zoom to allow us to connect in the meantime. And thank you to all the organizers, Carter and Lynn, and fellow presenter Jen, and certainly learned a lot about those interesting nocturnal songs of Ovenbirds, which has always been a source of fascination. So a great pleasure to be here, and look forward to whatever happens down the road.
All right. So, and then now to wrap things up, this is the end of the festival. So thanks to everyone